Hello everyone, so today we're going to be covering energy flow in an ecosystem. The learning targets that we're going to be going over today is I can analyze the path of energy transfer through successive trophic levels of a food web or an energy pyramid. I can explain how food chains and trophic levels are related. I can explain how food chains and energy pyramids are related, and I can explain why the amount of available energy is reduced in successive trophic levels. So as you can see here, the main focus of today's lesson is going to be energy transfer in an ecosystem. So the first thing we want to talk about are food chains. Food chains are a series of steps and they show one possible pathway of energy. Essentially, these arrows that you see right here in the food chain are they are representing the feeding relationships that are going on, and they're also showing the energy that is going into the mouth of the predator. So if we begin here with the autotroph, and remember, producers are going to harness the sun's energy and they're going to store it, all right? So the producer or the autotroph is eaten by the primary consumer, okay? Remember that consumers are organisms that feed on other organisms, and we kind of place them in categories. So if a consumer feeds on a producer directly, we refer to that consumer as a primary consumer, as you can see right here. If a consumer feeds on the primary consumer, all right, that is going to be known as or categorized as the secondary consumer. The predator or the organism that feeds on the secondary consumer is going to be categorized as the tertiary consumer. Okay, so this is where these categories come from. Producer are things like plants, but remember, they don't have to be plants. They could be things like phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, any type of organism that makes its own food. Okay, so one more time. The food chain is showing feeding relationships that are going on, but it's also showing the movement of energy from one organism to the other to the other. Another way we can represent the amount of energy in an ecosystem or feeding relationships that are going on is using an energy pyramid. So essentially what we could do is we could take this food chain right here and we could place it, or we could represent it as an energy pyramid diagram. Now, the benefit of using an energy pyramid, just from its name, we can kind of guess what extra piece of information an energy pyramid gives us. It gives us the amount of energy that is present in an ecosystem. The food chain did not. It didn't tell us how much energy is present at each level of this food chain. It just told us who eats who, okay, who's the producer, who's the primary consumer, who's the secondary consumer, etc. Energy pyramids are going to show you how the amount of energy is moving from one organism to another, how much of it is moving, and how much of this energy is actually decreasing as we move through the trophic levels. In addition to the amount of energy decreasing as we move up trophic levels, okay, and I'll explain more what trophic levels are. For now, I just want you to think of trophic levels as energy levels, okay? So the amount of energy available in each level of the ecosystem. So as we move through a food chain, or as we move up an energy pyramid, we read an energy pyramid upwards, okay? So the producers go on the bottom, and then we have the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary. And in this particular food chain, in this particular ecosystem, we see that there is actually an additional level. This is known as the quaternary, okay? Quaternary consumer. So essentially what's going on, if you notice, the energy pyramid is showing us how much energy is available, and we calculate energy using a unit known as kilocalories or calories. Whenever you consume food, if you look at a food label, right, it will tell you how many calories or how many units of energy are found in the food that you're eating. So kilocalories are the units that we use in order to calculate energy. Let's take a look at this energy pyramid right here. We begin with the producers having 10,000 units of or kilocalories of energy, and this number continuously is going to decrease as we move up the energy pyramid. Now, as this amount of energy decreases, moving up the trophic levels, okay, that we see right here, the population size will also decrease. What does this mean? This means that if we look at an ecosystem, there's always going to be much more producers and much more primary consumers than, for example, tertiary consumers or quaternary consumers. In other words, as you move up an energy pyramid and the amount of energy decreases, this accommodates less and less population of that group of organisms or of that type of species, all right? Which makes a lot of sense, okay? Because if there is less energy available, then this means that less organisms can exist, less organisms are able to survive, to live, etc., all right? So obviously something that an organism such as grass that has 10,000 kilocalories of energy, you could afford to have a lot of them because there's enough energy to support and sustain that population number. But something like a hawk, okay, that only has 1 kilocalorie of energy, you're not going to have a lot of hawk populations or a lot of hawks in the population of hawks. All right, so basically what we want to take away from this slide is the following. An energy pyramid is a different representation of a food chain. The difference is that it's showing us the amount of energy that is present at each trophic level. And it also shows us that the number of organisms also reflect the decreasing amount of energy that exists. Now, what exactly are trophic levels? Trophic levels, like I said, are energy levels, and they represent steps in a food chain or an energy pyramid, as we saw. Producers represent the first trophic level. Primary consumers represent the second trophic level. Secondary consumers represent the third trophic level, and tertiary consumers represent the fourth trophic level. If we had a quaternary consumer, that would be the fifth trophic level, as we saw right here, right? The hawk is the fifth trophic level. But I won't usually go that far, so usually we'll stop here at the fourth trophic level. So what happens to energy as it moves through a food chain? Like we said, the amount of energy available decreases as you move through a food chain or as you move up an energy pyramid. Where did that energy go? So 90% of the energy is actually used by the organism for things like cellular respiration, active transport, metabolism, growth, reproduction, and all the other energy consuming basically processes we talked about that are continuously happening in your body, in any organism's body, to keep them alive. All right, so 90% of the energy is going to those reactions. Some of the energy is also actually lost as heat, just by existing. Right, our bodies are always emitting a certain amount of heat, and this heat is essentially coming from cellular respiration, and it's actually a waste product. Okay, we can think of it as a byproduct of cellular respiration. As these reactions are going on, our bodies are like machines. When you run any machine, like for example, if a car has been driven for a while and then it parks and you touch the hood of the car, if you touch the car itself where the engine is, you'll notice that it feels hot, right? That's because any form of machine, as the reactions go through it, it releases some form of heat as a byproduct. So our bodies are essentially just like that. They are machines. They continuously go through these reactions and they emit heat as a byproduct. Now, 90% is used by the organism. Now, what about the rest of the energy, right? What about the other 10%? Where does that go? Well, 10% is actually stored in the tissues of the organism. That remains, okay? It's there for building proteins, building muscles, building bones, etc., tissues. So it's kind of like stored in the body of the organism. And once that organism is consumed by a predator, that 10% is transferred or is passed onto the next organism or the next trophic level. And that is known in ecology as the rule of 10, meaning only 10% of the energy that is stored in an organism is passed on to the next trophic level. And we kind of saw that with the energy pyramid that we saw before. But let's take a look at it again. So here we have an energy pyramid, just like we saw, okay? And you have the different trophic levels. So we have the first trophic level with the primary producers, or we could just call them producers. We don't really need that word here, primary. And then the second trophic level has the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and here they call them third level consumers. I'm going to call them tertiary consumers, okay? And then finally, the apex predators, which are also known as quaternary consumers. As usual, science has a billion names for the same thing. It's just how we do. All right, so if we take a look here, we will notice that the primary producers, they have 100% of the energy. Essentially what they did is they took all the energy from the sun and they were able to store it as a glucose molecule. None of the energy was lost. But then when the primary consumer eats or feeds on that producer, they will only get 10% of the energy that was stored. Remember, the rule of 10 states that only 10% of the energy moves on to the next trophic level. Only 10% is going to move on to the primary consumers. And then only 10% of that is going to move on to the secondary consumers, and only 10% of the 1% is going to move on to the tertiary consumers. For those who hate math, this might be a bit complicated, but trust me, it's not that hard. I'll break it down into even simpler form once we start looking at a specific example next, all right? Now, above all, okay, you'll notice that we have the decomposers, right? Why do we have the decomposers here to the side? Remember from our last discussion, or from our previous discussion, we said that once the organisms die, decomposers are there to break down the remains of these organisms and release all the nutrients back into the essentially ecosystem, all right? So the decomposers are there so that at any level, at any trophic level, once these organisms die, they recycle their nutrients back into the food chain, food web, or even the energy pyramid that we see here. Remember that in addition to some of the energy being used by the organism to stay alive, undergo cellular respiration, reproduce, etc., some energy is also lost as heat. So this is where the green arrows represent. This is what the green arrows represent, all right? And of course, like we said in the previous discussion, that the main source of all this energy that we see here is the sun, okay? Now, let's do some practice to kind of put it all together. Let's assume that a producer has 2,452 units of energy and they've made that through photosynthesis. How much energy would a secondary consumer receive, all right? So if we go back to here, we know that a secondary consumer is the type of, or the category of consumer that feeds on a primary consumer. So we know that the secondary consumer is in which trophic level? The third trophic level, okay? So according to our energy pyramid here, the secondary consumer is in the third trophic level. Don't get confused by those. Just because the consumer is a secondary consumer, it doesn't mean they're in the second trophic level. Please be mindful of that because that can get a bit confusing. So you want to go by, you always begin with the producers. The producers are always going to be first trophic level. Use that as your kind of baseline so that you can calculate the rest moving on from there. All right, so going back to this, it says that the producer has 2,452 kilojoules of energy, or units of energy. The first thing we want to do is we want to move the decimal place over one place to the left. So if the decimal place is right here, okay, if the decimal place is right here, we're going to move it one place to the left, all right? And if we do that, then our primary consumer is going to have 245.2 units of energy, okay? If we move the decimal place over one more time to the left, we will find out what our secondary consumer has in terms of energy, and that is 24.52, and we can put a unit there, of course, as kilojoules of energy, or in this case, because the question didn't tell us kilojoules, we would just put units of energy, all right? Now, obviously food chains and energy pyramids are a great tool to represent ecosystems, but they don't really provide a very realistic representation of how ecosystems are, because ecosystems don't just move in one direction, right? We don't just have that. If we're looking at an environment, if we're looking at an ecosystem, we won't just have these four organisms, right? We'll have a much larger number of organisms, and the feeding relationships are a lot more complex. In other words, the frog doesn't just eat a grasshopper, it also eats other things too, like other insects or even certain organisms that might be living in the aquatic environment that the frog lives in. So food chains are great simplified representations of ecosystems, but they're not extremely accurate. A more accurate representation is a food web. And a food web basically shows the interconnected food chains, so multiple food chains, and all the feeding relationships that exist in an ecosystem. And therefore, they are a lot more realistic. So you'll notice here that an organism like the rabbit, it eats, this producer right here, this type of plant, but that's not the only plant it eats. It also eats the prickly pear, all right? You'll notice here, for example, the snake eats the grasshopper, but it also feeds on the rabbit and also feeds on the kangaroo rat. So essentially, it's showing a more comprehensive view of the feeding relationships in an ecosystem. You need to be able to decipher food chains, energy pyramids, and food webs, all right? And another thing that's super important to remember is that all these organisms that you see here in this food web are connected. Remember, we are all connected. We share a global ecosystem that we all live in. If one of these organisms is affected somehow, all the other organisms that live in this ecosystem will also be affected, all right? So let's assume, for example, that this fox right here is killed off because of overhunting. Humans have hunted this fox so much that it's now extinct, all right? That's a very extreme scenario, but let's assume that this basically fox no longer exists, all right? How is this going to affect the rest of the ecosystem? Well, the population of jackrabbits, because they used to be eaten by the fox, that population is going to now, it might increase, correct? Because essentially it has less predators. Same with all the other predators that used to feed on the fox. So they would all basically, that population would increase. If that fox was, so let's look at another example. What about if the population of kangaroo rats died off? What would that do? Basically, the population of the foxes and the hawks would decrease because now they have one less thing to eat, right? Before, they would feed on rabbits, snakes, and the kangaroo rat. But now that kangaroo rat does not exist, which means that these predators have less food to eat, so their population will decrease, all right? I hope that was a bit clear in terms of the food webs. That takes us to the end of our discussions today. As usual, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and see you next time.